Hello and welcome back to Him Reads as we continue with Straight On Till Morning. Pernicious Pixies. Wendy stumbled backward. She wasn't hit hard enough to fall down, but the tiny points of the fairy's fingers, head, sting her, jabbed right in the middle of her ribcage, knocking the wind out of her. It would have probably leave a nasty bruise. She wearily regarded her attacker. The fairy, again, Wendy assumed, was an angry, tinkling ball of light with the prettiest girl imaginable inside. Diminutive but solid, with a scandalous lack of decorous dress. All she wore was a ragged green outfit which barely covered her hips and thighs and breasts, was gathered dangerously over one shoulder. They were both shocking and delightful. It made tiny creatures resemble statues of ancient nymphs and nereids Wendy had seen. Her hair was even done up in a classical style, a goddess-like bun of hair so golden it glowed. Tiny pointed ears curved their way through the few dangling tresses. Her eyes were enormous and not even remotely human. They were far apart and glaring. The crowning glory was, of course, a pair of delicate, iridescent wings sprouting from her back. Their shape was somewhere between butterfly and dragonfly. They were clear as glass and thin as onion skin. The fairy chimed and jiggled angrily, shedding little sparkles of golden light that danced for a bit in the air before drifting down to the ground and fading. Wendy couldn't tell where the girl's lovely tinkling sound was coming from exactly. At first she thought it was bells on the tiny shoes, but close inspection revealed nothing. The chimes, like the dust, seemed to come from her very essence. "Oh, I'm sorry," Wendy breathed, apologizing for her being in the way of the beautiful little thing. "Are you all right?" The tinkling grew more insistent. The fairy bobbed up and down in the air and balled her tiny hands into fists. She aimed at Wendy's chest again and struck her. Perhaps, as she was it for this time, the pain was no worse than a bumblebee accidentally knocking into her and then buzzing drowsily off in the sunlight. "Whatever's the matter?" Wendy asked patiently. "Have I done something wrong? Will you tell me?" Luna barked once, 4 feet planted firmly and defensively. The fairy suddenly dipped to the ground, the light emanating from her dimmed. "What is it?" The fairy stamped on the dirt and pointed at it. "Am I trampling your flower?" Wendy asked, stepping back carefully and examining the prints where she had just stood. There was no crushed petal there, just some grass and sand. No dead insects either. The fairy gritted her teeth in frustration and flew back up to Wendy. She grabbed a lock of her hair and yanked, hoisting it over her shoulder like the heaviest rope on a ship. "Oh, hey, what is it? You merely have to tell me," Wendy cried, stumbling farther into the clearing, trying to free from the pixie's grasp. Apparently satisfied, the creature released her grip and drove back to the ground and walked, slowly and carefully, over the ground along "my shadow," Wendy said slowly. A sinking feeling came over her. Her shadow crossed her arms knowingly. "Not my shadow, of course," Wendy said, biting her lip. "Peter Pan's shadow." The fairy nodded twice, slowly and solidly. No misinterpretation possible. Wendy sighed. The time of reckoning had come far sooner than she expected. She had hoped for a little more time in Neverland before her choices caught up with her. How did this fairy even know about it, really? Wendy thought she would have to apologize to Peter, not anyone else. Of course, she had also rather hoped that the imminent doom of Neverland would overshadow any mistakes or transgressions on her part. "I don't have it anymore." The fairy's eyes widened. She started to move uncertainly, perhaps to pull Wendy's hair again, perhaps to shrug. Why? Perhaps to make emotions to get a fuller explanation, but Wendy's guilty conscience was very ahead of her. I traded it to Captain Hook to return for my passage here, she said calmly. Her shadow did a sarcastic little curtsy, as if to say, thank you, now we're getting somewhere. The second stretched out to infinity as Wendy watched the fairy register what she had just said. She could feel the tropical sun on her back, feeling the breeze from the sea lift up the little hairs off her forehead. Smell Luna's clean but doggy fur scent as she waited for a reaction. When the fairy's eyes had wandered further than it seemed possible, she dove at Wendy again, here and there and everywhere at once, pinching, pulling, yanking her hair, and biting. Wendy covered her face and flung herself around the clearing, trying to get away from the creature without hurting her. It was like being attacked by an angry swarm of bees, or a dozen fairies at once. Oh, stop, please. Luna leapt up and bit at the air, snapping and growling and trying to grab the annoying flying thing that was hurting her friend. As she slapped madly at the air around her, Wendy prayed that neither one of them actually injured the fairy. Finally, Luna's muzzle attacked the creature hard on her tiny behind, and she went tumbling over her feet straight to a tree. She slid down, landing in a heap among the roots. Oh no, are you alright? Wendy cried, immediately running over despite the myriad pinches and tiny cuts she had suffered from the attack. She knelt down and cradled the stunned fairy carefully in her hands. The fairy sat up, swaying woozily. Then she leaned over and sank her teeth into Wendy's thumb. Now, stop at this instant, Wendy said sternly, gripping her a little more tightly around the middle. Let us try discussing this like an adult, like civilized people. I take it you are a friend of Peter's? For yet again, this creature, this particular fairy, wasn't one she had invented in her Neverland tales. She didn't imagine her brothers could have come up with anything like her. The tiny girl pouted and frowned and crossed her arms sullenly. It was so adorable, Wendy had to work very hard not to giggle. Well, I'm very sorry about what I did. I'm not proud of it. I messed up, she admitted. But look here, your friend Peter left his shadow in my bedroom. Ages ago. 4 years, in fact. I'm a little curious as to how it's just, it didn't try to escape on its own or anything. Yes, for years I've kept it safe, free from dust, awaiting Peter's return. Of course, I've had every intention of giving it back. I'm not a thief, but he never returned. The fairy looked uncomfortable. Her eyes darted to the side and she squirmed a little in Wendy's palm. For years I've waited for him, Wendy continued, trying not to sound too sorrowful. She was in the wrong, after all. Every night I told stories about him, watched the night sky for him. Then they moved me out of the nursery. Michael and John went to school. I was left all by myself, alone and waiting. And still he never came. I grew despondent, I suppose. The boys didn't want to hear my stories anymore. If it wasn't for the shadow, I would have begun to think I'd imagined every last moment of Neverland. Life was so dreary and dreck. And then my parents bought me this stupid dog. Not you, Luna, she added before the wolf could even react. Luna wagged her tail happily. And then they decided to send me away to Ireland. Ireland! They only wanted to see me settle down with a nice boy, with a nice job, in a nice office somewhere, or as a spinster governess in some remote location. And I don't want either of those things. Not yet, anyway. Despite her anger, the fairy made a questionable tinkle that wasn't too hard to interpret. Well, I don't know what I really want. I want to see Neverland, obviously, Wendy answered, indicating the world around them. She opened her fingers, loosened her grip on the fairy. I want adventures. I don't know, other things. Certainly not to do laundry aboard a pirate ship for the rest of my life. Yes, I'm ashamed of what I did. It was a bad deed. But Peter can't miss his shadow much, since he never came to get it. The fairy tinkled angrily at her, rising off her palm and clenching her tiny hands once again in this tiny adorable fist. All right, look, before you start again, 2 things. I'm perfectly willing to make amends for what I did. Wendy said, squaring her shoulders. Whatever it takes, right now. Her shadow stood up straight upon hearing this, intrigued. The fairy frowned at her suspiciously. I'm absolutely serious. Also, number two, and potentially far more importantly, either as a result of my actions or alongside of them, Neverland is in trouble. Captain Hook seems to like he needs to destroy the whole island. We need to stop him and find Peter. He and the Shadow are involved somehow, and I'll do whatever it takes to accomplish those things. She meant it. She conjured up images in her head of all those sorts of brave Englishmen and realized she couldn't think of a single face. But the idea of dying at sword point or being forced to walk the plank in a dramatic rescue attempt was somehow still easier to swallow than an eternity of serving aboard a pirate ship as a nanny and scullery maid. The fairy re-narrowed her eyes, obviously re-evaluating the human. Then she nodded. Once. Not enthusiastically. Shall we go then? Wendy asked primly. Last I saw, the pirates were headed north, or what would have been north in England, of the coast. We need to get some help to stop them. I should think. More of your fairies, perhaps? And mermaids might be helpful. Or we could arrange some sort of boat, one with cannons, I expect, and a willing crew. The fairy stamped her foot angrily, then lowered herself back into Wendy's hand so the big human girl could actually feel it. She shook her head. She pointed to the jungle. I'm sorry, I don't. The fairy snarled in frustration. Then she made a big show of miming the act and looking for something or someone, shielding her eyes from the sun peering into the distance. She pretended to find the thing and marched dramatically toward it. She had a whole conversation with this thing, which was now obviously a person, took him by the hand and pretended to fly off. Then she and he about a small army together or succumbed to St. Vitus's dance. It was hard to tell which. Oh, you want to find Peter Pan first, Wendy said, suddenly realized what it all meant. Find him and bring him along to Shadow back from the pirates. The fairy nodded excitedly and for a breathtaking second looked absolutely delighted that Wendy understood. But I don't know much time Neverland has. Do you even know where he is? The fairy shrugged and looked exasperated, throwing her arms out to indicate all of Neverland. Wendy wondered, from the way the fairy was acting, if the two friends had ever separated before this happened. In spite of all her determination to save the world, Wendy was ashamed to admit her first reaction was, no, let's not go find Peter Pan first. Only because she would have to tell her hero straight off that she had sold his shadow to his enemy. It was one thing to admit wrongdoing to a random fairy. To the person you've slighted himself, well, it took a different kind of courage. Well, he isn't so useful right now without a shadow, she ventured. The fairy frowned and pointed again. But perhaps we could drum up some other help against the pirate first. The fairy crossed her arms and closed her eyes hauntingly, shaking her head. Oh, please, Wendy said. Even with Peter Pan, the two of us can't take on the entire pirate crew. In all my stories about Peter Pan, he fights Captain Hook, man to man, not against all of them. The fairy turned her head away and sniffed. Wendy rubbed her forehead. She hadn't had a lot of experience cajoling people, beyond her father at least, much less an irrational little creature like this. The thing wouldn't listen to logic or reason. But of course she was a fairy. Why would she put up with a terribly human ideas like logic and reason? Wendy thought about her mother's gentle arguments with shopkeepers when the darling account came a bit short. Well, how about this, she said, using her best reasonable voice. Let's go fetch Peter, but perhaps we should start with the Lost Boys. He's always with his crew, so he might be there, or they might know where he is. And if he's not there, we can see if they're interested in joining us for our big run-ins with the pirates, all right? The fairy pouted and looked suspicious, as if she thought Wendy was trying to trick her somehow. But she couldn't find anything obviously wrong with what had been suggested, so she nodded, reluctantly. All right, let's... And the fairy took off like a shot, a golden bauble that zipped high into the air and disappeared. "All right," Wendy repeated, uncertainly watching it go. "I can't fly," she added after a moment. The clearing was silent except for the chirping of a single insect. It regarded Wendy through what looked like a tiny pair of spectacles. "I'll just walk then, I guess," she adjusted to her dress and looked at Luna. "Shall we? I think the hangman's tree is due north of us and a bit east. We may need to do a bushwhack. A pity I don't have a machete or some such." And I'm going to stop it there. Hang on.